So hello again and welcome everyone to the second set of our subject knowledge talks for English teachers. As I mentioned, I'll say again as there's a couple of people who've just come in, we'll be looking at firstly using discourse analysis to teach A Streetcar Named Desire and other plays as well. I say other plays as well because while I'll be talking specifically about A Streetcar Named Desire today, I'm using this really as an exemplification of what's possible when we use ideas from language study and we apply them to literary texts. So if you teach A Streetcar Named Desire, that's great, and it's on A-level English literature and language and literature spec, so hopefully it will be useful in that sense. But even if you don't teach this play, I really think some of these ideas are applicable to lots of other plays as well. So as an overview then of what I'm going to be talking about today, A Streetcar Named Desire, as I've said, is used to exemplify the affordances. I've already started talking about that briefly, but it is something I'll be returning to as I go through the presentation today to help you hopefully think about how you can apply some of these principles. And what I aim to show is that even when teaching drama on literature specs as well as on Langlit specs, knowledge of discourse analysis can help students with their ability to analyse language and how meanings are communicated. And I think it's particularly useful for exploring anywhere in a play where we see explorations of power dynamics, or for looking at social relations and relationships between characters as well. So I'm just going to begin then by outlining what discourse analysis is. So for those of you who are A-level English language teachers, this will already be quite familiar to you, I think, but for some of us who are perhaps from a literature background, it might not be. So discourse analysis is usually associated with the study of real-life conversation, and it's used as a tool for the analysis of interpersonal communication. So it's something that, according to Foucault's original development of it, can help us to identify and analyse the enactment of power in language. But now, often when we're talking about discourse analysis, we're often talking as well about critical discourse analysis, which explores how language reflects power relations between individuals and social groups. So essentially then, discourse analysis is all about looking critically at language and the way individuals communicate within language and the way in which that reflects society. But since literature is another type of discourse, we can also apply principles and ideas from discourse analysis to the analysis of literature. According to Fowler, since in literature we see the dialectical relationship between language and social structure, therefore it's possible for us to apply principles from language studies to literary texts. So we can look at literary texts and use discourse analysis to ask how are social structures expressed or communicated and enacted in texts. So Short argues that discourse analysis can be used to explore the language of drama texts, even though this is a form of what we might see as artificially designed communication. Of course, the language that exists in a play script has been designed and put there in a certain way by the writer, and it's not naturally occurring communication. So in my chapter for the book that I co-edited with Marcello last year, and also with Fazine Ahmed and Felicity Titjen, I talked in this book about using 3 useful theories from discourse analysis to explore A Streetcar Named Desire. So today I'm going to talk about those 3 theories, and I'm going to explain and try to exemplify some of the ways in which they could be applied. So those are speech act theory, Grice's cooperative principle, and also theories of politeness as well. So to begin with then, I'm going to introduce speech act theory. So again, something that many of you may be familiar with if you're language A-level teachers, and particularly you might be familiar with it in terms of looking at conversation, usually rather than literature. So according to speech act theory, an utterance has three functions, and this is really the idea of performative utterance, where Austin states that a spoken utterance expressed by an individual performs an action. So Austin suggested then that an utterance has a locutionary act, which means it has a surface or obvious meaning, but it also has an illocutionary force. And the illocutionary force refers to the underlying intention of an utterance. And there's also a perlocutionary effect that refers to the effect resulting from the utterance and the hearer's reaction. So I think this idea and this concept becomes easier to understand if we apply it, and particularly in terms of thinking about how it can be useful. In A Streetcar Named Desire, then, we can use this concept of performative utterance to help students to see the different potential meanings behind aspects of the language. So here's an exchange between Stella and Stanley, and then I'll talk about how we can look at some of these utterances in terms of their locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary force. And so here we see Stella say, "You come out with me while Blanche is getting dressed." Stanley, "Since when do you give me orders?" Stella, "Are you going to stay here and insult her?" Stanley, "You're damn tootin' I'm going to stay here." So in this section of the play then, in this exchange, we could see Stanley's statement, for instance, "Since when do you give me orders?" as having a locutionary meaning, so a surface meaning of expressing genuine confusion. So a question to his wife regarding at what point she decided to start giving him orders. But we can introduce the idea of illocutionary force to students to help them understand the underlying meaning of that utterance. So as an underlying meaning then, it has this under the surface significance of criticizing Stella, challenging her husband's position as head of the household. So while that might be easier for someone who's really experienced with analysis of literature to understand without using these different lenses, what this does is it provides an enabling force for students who aren't perhaps as confident with looking at different layers of meaning to be able to see that statements and utterances have different levels of meaning to them. And we can also take this further as well, and we can enable students to look at the perlocutionary effect of an utterance too. So what is the consequence of this, and what is its intention as an action? So as an action, it works to stop Stella using commanding language towards her husband. And we can see actually that that does work, that she then responds with, "Are you going to stay here and insult her?" So while she's not backing down from the confrontation completely, she's stopped ordering her husband around, and she's stopped telling him what to do at that point. So it has actually had that perlocutionary effect. So according to speech act theory then, by looking at the three different layers of this, we can think about Stanley's language not only reflecting his patriarchal context, but actually being this active entity that helps to construct and enact it as well. So I'm also going to introduce a couple more ideas from discourse analysis and use these as well to think about how it can help enable analysis of the play too. But again, as I'm talking, you might like to think about plays you know and how you could apply these ideas as well. So Grice's cooperative principle, again, might be familiar to some of you. This is an idea from discourse analysis that states that effective communication takes place through the maxims of quantity, quality, relation, and manner. So quantity means one tries to be as informative as one can and give as much information as is needed and no more within cooperative communication. And quality is the idea that you try to be truthful and do not give information that is false. And relation is where one tries to be relevant and say things that are relevant to the discussion. And manner is where someone tries to be clear and avoid obscurity and ambiguity. So what's interesting when looking at Grice's maxims and his cooperative principle is not just thinking about where these maxims are enacted and where they are used in language, but really where they are broken and flouted, and thinking about the significance of that. So it's helpful for thinking about how flouting the maxims interacts as well with the construction of meaning. So here's an example then from an exchange between Stanley and Blanche this time. So here, I'm just going to just move this over so we can see. So here Stanley in the exchange then says to Blanche, "What did you do that for, Blanche? So I could twist the broken end in your face." Stanley, "I bet you would do that." Blanche, "I would, I will if you..." Stanley, "Oh, so you want some roughhouse? All right, let's have some roughhouse." Okay, so in this exchange then, Stanley breaks several maxims, and this is significant because this is a section of the play where, if you know the play well, you'll know this is soon before he rapes Blanche. So before he commits this act of violence, his language also reflects his violence and demonstrates his power and seeking to gain control through the way he flouts Grice's maxims. So you might look at, for example, with students, the way that he breaks the maxim of relation by deliberately misconstruing Blanche's threat to hurt him as an invitation to a roughhouse. And we see later on that he's taken a sexual connotation from that. That begins to be developed here. But he deliberately infers a different meaning from the one that she communicates. And he's also breaking the maxim of manner in the same line, as his language is obscure and somewhat ambiguous. So the violence is only confirmed by the performative elements that are embedded in the stage directions and then enacted on stage too. And we can see then that he is flouting the rules of cooperative conversation in the same way as he then goes on to disregard the rules of morality and law in what he then goes on to do. And this shows then that breaking cooperative principles can act as a means of power assertion. So they're a fascinating way of thinking about the enactment of power in literary texts as well as in social situations and in conversation. And looking at this with students then can help them to understand that violence is embedded in the discourse, as I mentioned at the start, even before the physical and sexual violence has taken place. So finally then, we've looked at Grice's maxims and we've looked at Austin's speech act theory. And finally, I want to look at two different theories of politeness and think about how these could be applied as well. So according to Brown and Levinson's politeness theory, individuals seek to avoid experiencing face-threatening acts or utterances that damage face by others. If participants in a conversation are being polite, they will generally seek to avoid imposing face-threatening acts or FTAs on other participants. FTAs might either be positive or negative, and we can seek to gain both positive face or seek to avoid taking that from others. And this is the desire to be liked or approved of, or also negative face, which means the desire not to be imposed upon and to have autonomy. So a positive FTA might refer to an individual's self-esteem or self-worth being threatened, whereas a negative FTA might mean an individual's freedom to act or freedom of choice is impinged upon. So here's an example of an exchange between Blanche and Stella, and again it becomes a little bit easier to understand how this works if we look at this in practice, how we'd apply it. So Blanche says, "Now don't say it was one of those mysterious electric things between people. If you do, I'll laugh in your face." Stella, "I'm not going to say anything more at all about it." Blanche, "All right then, don't." Stella, "But there are things that happen between a man and a woman in the dark that sort of make everything else seem unimportant. Okay, so looking at this exchange then, if we use the concept of face-threatening acts, we can enable students to identify some different ways in which Stella's face is threatened by Blanche's language. So for example, when Blanche says, "If you do, I'll laugh in your face," this is a clear example of a positive FTA because she is showing unequivocal disapproval of Stella and her feelings. So what she's doing then, if we look back at the idea of positive face, she's taking away her ability to be liked or approved of in terms of that exchange. When she says, now don't say, this is a negative FTA because it's restricting Stella's autonomy to respond freely, and therefore giving her limited autonomy in response. That then leads Stella to concede power to Blanche when she says she's not going to say anything about it. But then on the other hand, she then later does explain her relationship with Stanley in the dark. And we can see this as an attempt to regain face then in this exchange. So the concept of face can be useful in helping students to identify ways in which characters can gain power through engaging in face-threatening acts, and also try and retain their own power when their own face is threatened as well by another character. So again, it's one of these concepts from conversation analysis that actually can be really useful when looking at literary texts as well, and thinking about how language works on a number of levels. Finally then, similarly, Lakoff's politeness principle states that in order to be polite, verbal language observes 3 rules of formality, hesitancy, and camaraderie. So these are: don't impose on the addressee, allow the addressee options, and act as though you and the addressee were equal, make them feel good. Now, again, as with all these theories, this is one theory in principle, and there are other politeness theories that suggest that this might need further development. So this is again to be taken as an exemplification of how we can use politeness theories. You could use other politeness theories as well. But if we use Lakoff's theory, we can see that Blanche violates all 3 of Lakoff's rules for politeness. She imposes her own viewpoints on Stella's relationship with her husband before Stella can respond. She uses imperatives which tell Stella what not to say, and this therefore limits her options in how to reply. And she does not make the receiver feel good. So, for example, she threatens to laugh at Stella's defense of her husband. So using these really simple principles can, again, be useful in analysing drama in this way too. So in this way, students can see then that by flouting each aspect of Lakoff's politeness principle, we see Blanche directly trying to gain power over Stella, and we also can think about the relationship between the 2 sisters as being reflected as well in this way too. So the lack of politeness being telling there in terms of the way that Blanche relates to Stella and vice versa. And again, then this can facilitate thoughtful analysis for students of the ways in which impolite language can disrupt conventions of politeness in discourse. So in conclusion then, looking at discourse analysis can be a really useful way into exploring enactment of power in language, as well as helping to develop understanding of character relationships too. These theories can be applied to a wide variety of plays, and they can help students to understand how language reflects wider social context, but also how, in the words of Fairclough, it contributes to shaping and reshaping and reproducing and transforming these contexts. Overall then, discourse analysis can be incredibly helpful, not only if you are teaching language or even language and literature, but actually on when teaching literature specifications as well. So I hope that's been really useful. I've left some time, I hope, just a couple of minutes for questions. So feel free to put hands up or put them in the chat, and I'd love to answer some questions.